The early modern period, part two. Today we talk about specifically the rise of Western Europe. This is where I will probably spend the majority of today's class time, the rise of Western Europe. That's our focus. And then I will um, avoid dwelling on the rise of the Western Europe too much because then we'll run out of time for gunpowder empires. So I don't want to hurry through that. So I have to constantly check myself and say, move on, move on. But there is a reason why we want to dwell on the rise of Western Europe. I think I've said this a few times in class. If world history is like an epic narrative, if world history was a movie, a story, then Western Europe, I'm sorry to say, is one of the main protagonists so far, right? Who knows what will happen in the future, but so far in history, Western Europe is like the protagonist, is the main character, right? So here in early modern period two, we see the rise of Western Europe. This is when Western Europe comes on the world stage, shows itself in all of its glory or all of its whatever it is. Okay, so that's why it's important that we dwell on it to absorb fully how it rose during this period, early modern period. And then we also talk about the gunpowder empires. So, Rise of the West, introduction. This man is Martin Luther. With his hammer, he's about to nail onto the door of a church. What's called, okay. So this is Martin Luther. So Renaissance started in Italy during the post-classical, but started to migrate to north and west from around 1450. Notice that's around the time of, roughly around the time when the post-classical began to finish. Gradually transitioned to the Age of Enlightenment. So Renaissance was a gradual process, transitioned into what we call the Age of Enlightenment with modern science. If you want to get into the weeds of it, I think it's the Age of Reason and then the Age of Enlightenment. I think it's like the 17th, 18th century. Or is it, I'm sorry, the 16th, 17th century? My mind is, sometimes it plays tricks on me. So for our purpose, Renaissance transitioned to the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment, more than anything, is the age of modern science. So I don't want us to dwell on it too much, but the focus really is the rise. The rise of Western Europe is really the rise of modern science. Reformation is a big thing that happened. The Protestant separation from the Roman Catholic Church started in Germany with Martin Luther. So the thing that he nailed onto the church door is called Luther's 95 Theses. He made these 95 statements complaining about how the church is run. This was one clergyman talking to the clergy, talking to the establishment. We need to reform the church. The church has become corrupt in so many ways, right? Superstition. We've got moved away from God and Jesus and worshiping God the proper way. We've accumulated too many bad things. We need to reform the church. It started out innocuously enough, right? Theological debates. But this thing started a fire that burned through Europe for, I guess, over a century, or almost a century and a half, and it killed millions and millions of people. So it's an important event that happened. Right. Originally, theological controversies spread quickly, caused religious wars. Oh, right. I'm sorry. Almost 200 years, culminating with what they call the 30 Years' War. Total about 15 to 20 million people died, they say. Who knows the exact numbers, right? But they're speculating up to something like 20 million people died in Europe. Mostly, this was a European thing. And then it officially ended with what's called the Peace Treaty of 1648. This marked official end of wars and it spurred on the rise to nation states and the decline of the Holy Roman Empire. So we'll elaborate on this more. So this, I put it in red because this was an important event. Apparently, this was not the first peace treaty that was signed. There were like other peace treaties before. There was one that happened almost like 100 years before, but that didn't hold. This is the really important peace treaty, the peace treaty of 1648. And I noted the Holy Roman Empire ended in the 19th century. This was the beginning of the end. So we say. The peace treaty, right, the Peace of Westphalia, I think that's how you say it, Westphalia, because the peace treaty was signed of 1648, it was signed in Westphalia. I don't know who these people are, but we have a sense of who they represent. So we'll talk about that. Um, we're introducing the rise of the West. Right? One is Renaissance that transitioned to the Age of Enlightenment. The Reformation was a very important thing that again happened that that helped the rise of the West. West had, on the one hand, the absolute monarchs, and the representative figure for that is Louis the 14th, known as the Sun King. He was a French king. He was one of the most powerful kings of that time, apparently. We don't deal with him, except to say, in some ways, he was a great king, but in other ways, he was a terrible king. It was a mixed bag. And apparently, his incredible spending bankrupted the country, and it eventually led to the French Revolution later on. Philip II in Spain, figures like Ivan the Fourth, Ivan the Terrible, I think that, and Peter the Great. We talked about him. Peter the Great, the great uh, westernization of Russia. Yeah, we kind of just mentioned them because we skipped these two in the story of world religions. So Isabella and Ferdinand II, they were absolute monarchs. They wanted to be, right, with their Spanish Inquisition. This is, yeah, Ivan the Terrible, the Fourth, Peter the Great. These were the absolute monarchs. Absolute because they said, I am God's representative. My power comes from divinity, right? God appointed me to be your ruler, right? So I am above the laws. Any laws that you guys come up with are below my power because I have been divinely appointed. So God appointed absolute monarchs. Constitutional monarchs developed as well, parliamentary system in such nations as Sweden and the Netherlands, but we focused on Britain's Magna Carta because that's what what leads to the United States, founding of the United States, and Magna Carta leads to the Bill of Rights. So that was an important development, guaranteeing rights to people. The idea that kings are not above the law. Kings are under the law. And mentioned Queen Elizabeth's golden age. She had to consult the parliament. And then the Civil War, we had the Glorious Revolution leading to the Bill of Rights. These were important developments that happened under the constitutional monarch system. Eventually, this power struggle went to the parliaments, right? That's another distinguishing thing about Western Europe is that they eventually moved away from absolute monarchs to constitutional monarchs and or slash democracy, outright democracies, and getting rid of monarchies. E is, like I said, the most important thing that happened is the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The most significant, it pushed West to what we call nowadays modernity, right? The biggest thing that's noticeable is the Industrial Revolution that started happening. Sorry, I'm sorry, the Industrial Revolution happened. I misspoke. It would lead to the Industrial Revolution. So that is the long 19th century. But the Industrial Revolution happened because of this, because of the rise of science in Western Europe. And we start with in Britain, I think, right? It started way, way in the West. Britain is the westmost part of Europe, right? Started with them. And the this is the early modern now, not the Industrial Revolution. Copernicus, this is do I have the date here? Okay, I don't have the date, so you don't have to know the date, but I believe this is like 1543, I think. I might be wrong. 1543 is when Copernicus came up with his Copernican solar system. That is usually seen as the starting date for modern science from Copernicus. And there's another guy like Kepler, and then these guys lead to Galileo Galilei, and then it culminates with Newton's theory of gravity. All these things happening one after the other in succession, accumulating these scientific discoveries, physics, astronomy, physics, biology, chemistry. So this is the age of modern science. Right. So the other thing is interregional trade. This is the time when the West takes to the center stage. It's not just one of the trading partners anymore. It takes the center stage. West begins to take over. So that's the introduction. So we're going to go through like commercialization, politics, culture. Uh, in terms of commercialization during the 16th to 18th century, more Europeans became involved in commerce. It wasn't just a top-down thing anymore with Western Europe. It wasn't just a top-down thing, just the ruler saying, do this. C- Commerce rose from the grassroots. So this is a picture of, I guess, a baker making bread and then selling his products. Southern French peasants began to produce wine for other regions. Why not us, right? Well, let's all be rich, right? We have some skills, we have some products. Let's trade locally. Began specializing in goods, agriculture, manufacturing. More people began to produce more goods. They embraced the idea of wealth. Being wealthy, being rich was no longer sinful, right? If you want to go to enter the kingdom of heaven, then you have to like be a camel or something. I'm wrecking that. What was that phrase? It is harder for a rich man to go to heaven than, a camel to go through the eye of a needle or something, right? For centuries, they had this idea, blessed are the poor, but no longer, right? Blessed are the rich. So growing merchant class, more people accumulating greater wealth. It also, because inevitably this kind of thing leads to a growing gap between the rich and the poor. This is when this thing happened. Commercialization inevitably brings about the gap between the rich and the poor. For them, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Lazy people will stay poor. If you're diligent, if you work hard, you'll be rich. So this mindset developed, wealth is good. You're wealthy, oh, that's because you're intelligent, you're smart, you're a hardworking person. And therefore, if somebody is poor, you begin to look down on them. It's no longer blessed are the poor. It's you miserable, you miserable beggar, right? Uh, so it's no longer blessed are the poor. They began to have this harsher attitude toward poverty in general. By the 18th century, Western Europeans had, so this is toward the end of the early modern era, Western Europeans especially had developed this idea of consumerism. I think this is later on, but like they talk about witch hunts. And this is a side thing. I'm sorry. I don't think it's a digression. They had like these things that we call witch hunts, right? The witches were mostly poor women, maybe widows who were outside the financial safety net of the society, right? And they were the ones that were mostly attacked during these witch hunts. The thing that made this is the United States now later on, the Salem's witch trial. That was unusual because some of the women accused of being witches, they weren't like poor old spinsters. They were respectable members of the society. That's why it was notorious. But regular witch hunts, right? They were mostly elderly women who were poor. So I read. Development in politics, European political system was broadly based on feudalism, but by the 17th century, they began to develop a new sense of unity. So this is the thing that happened in European countries. And this was contrasted with, we said, Russia, right? Russia stayed feudal, nationalistic. It changed only cosmetically in a sort of surfacey way, but it didn't change the way the West was changing. Feudalism was giving way to a new sense of unity. Governments became more central, began sending out more bureaucrats to provinces to ensure compliance and monitor the local conditions because they wanted to increase their tax revenue, I suppose, right? So they needed to know how many people were where, making how much money. This is known as census, right? Census. So now, because central governments began to be more scientific, more detailed about information they were collecting, national boundaries began to be more important. Before then, national boundaries were really fuzzy, but we began to have more strict lines of uh, uh, national boundaries. And because of that, people began to become more sensitive as to like, who am I? Oh, I'm a French person, right? Not somebody in the neighboring country. Governments also wanted more national unity. French monarchy began to regulate French language. It still is the case. France is very sensitive about the purity of its language, just like Koreans as well. Koreans are very sensitive about Korean. We are very protective of our language because of our history. Part of it is our history, like Sejong right? So we are very proud of our language. So we don't want Korean to be degraded or degenerated with, these infectious disease, sorry, infectious languages like English. Sorry, I don't know why I'm saying these things today. Uh, right. So things became more national level, like regulating language and state prisons. And also, I think this is next, and they began to be more careful about their armies. They began to create uniforms to distinguish their soldiers from other nations' soldiers. And they began to systemize their military, like they would have schools for, like military schools for officers. And then you could have a career. You could go up the ranks of officers, formal training for officers, and also they built hospitals and they began to have logistics for their commerce and the military. And they came up with things like pensions. If you serve the country for like 25, 30 years, you should be able to retire in comfort. We will provide you for the rest of your life. By the 17th to 18th century, the idea of nation state fully developed and took hold. This idea of nation state in Europe, it took hold, right? But globally, the idea of nation state took much, much longer. And I'm going to argue, this is in the second half of our term, I'm going to argue that the idea of nation state usually arose as a reaction to some external forces. I think that is almost a universal thing that happens in history. It's almost a universal phenomenon. The idea of a people usually form because it is a reaction to certain external forces. And you could think of the idea of the nation state forming early on in Western Europe, 17th, 18th century, that's early, because the rest of the world, it's like, for many of them, it's the 20th century. So it's centuries later, right? It formed early on, maybe because they were fighting all the time, right? All these little European countries, they were always fighting each other. And that kind of reaction would promote national unity. Who are we killing? Oh, we're killing Germans. Okay, then we must be French, right? Okay, who are we killing? Well, we're killing not us. It must be the French or something. So oftentimes it's hostilities and perceived enemies that inform us of who we are. The idea of nation state. What is the nation? It is a people created by shared belief that the people inside a country are connected to each other in some ways. Mostly it's race, it's by blood, by ethnicity, but not always. Sometimes it's a combination of race and maybe religious beliefs. But that's the idea of the nation. And a people should be governed by a state for them. Do I dare? Sure. A state is for a people, I'm sorry, a nation should be served by the state, created by the people, for the people, of the people, you see. That idea isn't, it wasn't created by Lincoln, right? For them, this is the idea of the nation state. What is the state? It should be something that was created by the people. That implies there is already a people already, right? Hand in hand, one group of people. Sorry, let's go on. Shared national identity, right. Decline of feudalism, strong rulers extended their authority over larger regions, centralized control over administration, military, economy. We saw that in the case of Russia. We saw how someone like Peter the Great took control of the feudal lords, right? He wanted to centralize the government. A strong centralized government is good for the nation. Absolute monarchs, powerful rulers, sought to create a unified nation identity through religious, cultural conformity. Absolute monarchs. And then with regards to absolute monarchs, so this is where I want to talk about the Peace Treaty of 1648. So the Reformation brought about this centuries of religious wars. It was a particularly vicious war because it wasn't just one people against another people. It came down to the level of individuals, right? It could be a brother fighting his own brother, right? Children turning against their parents because religious beliefs have a way of becoming extreme. You cannot compromise when it comes to the matter of my own eternal soul. And also my loved ones, right? Dad, I'm sorry, I have to hand you into the authorities because I don't want you to go to hell, right? I want your eternal soul to be saved. So they're going to take you, they're going to torture you, they're going to burn you at the stake, but your soul will be saved. I, I'm being maybe a little bit overly dramatic, but uh, it has this tendency to go toward the extremes when people start thinking that way, right? What we do in this life doesn't matter because we're talking about the eternal souls of myself, my loved ones. So it can't it did turn into a vicious thing. And also because this is a history class, this wasn't all about just religion. Started out as a religious conflict, but then it turned into, because it took a very long time, it turned into a political thing and combined with the rise of what we call the nation states, monarchs wanting to exert their power over the church. And that meant at this time the Holy Roman Empire. So after this, what they call the 30 Years' War, the peace treaty was signed because nobody won. Nobody was winning anything. And people were just getting sick and tired of people killing each other, right? They all became exhausted with this never-ending war. And it seemed like this war would never end unless you wiped out an entire nation, like genocide, basically, right? And they thought that is madness. So this peace treaty was a kind of resignation. Let us agree to disagree, right? You have your beliefs, I have my beliefs. Let us be tolerant of each other's differences. I'm sorry if you're going to hell, but I'm not going to kill you over it, right? So let us stay separate. Let us separate. Let us be with our own kinds. And the thing that happened with the treaty was because it became sort of a resignation, right? Let us decide to stay different. What that meant was it was really a win for the nation states. And this was the beginning of the end of the Holy Roman Empire, beginning of the end for the Catholic control of all of Europe. So through this peace treaty came the power of the monarchs because it was left to the monarchs to decide what the religion of his kingdom would be. If the monarch said, I'm a Lutheran, I'm gonna be a Lutheran, then his country became Lutheran. I'm gonna be a Calvinist. then his country became Calvinist. Or if it said, I'm going to be, I'm a faithful Roman Catholic subject, so I will stay Catholic, then his country stayed Catholic. And this, if you look at the date, 48, this is, I guess, a little bit after King Henry VIII, right? Henry VIII. So England by this time was already an Anglican Protestant country. So, right, emergence of nationalism, more people accepted the idea of nationalism based on shared cultural, linguistic, and ethnic characteristics. And much of that came out of the results of the peace treaty of 1648, because it was left up to the king, not to the Pope in Rome. It was left up to the king of each country, each region, to decide how he or she, queen, would unify and define, I suppose, yeah, it's not just unifying, right? How the king would define his own kingdom. Okay, so that's politics, culture, um, printing. That was a massive technological development, right? The Gutenberg printing press. It increased the readership of and literacy greatly. By the 18th century, by the end of the early modern period, the West had the highest literacy rates in the world. Its citizens were becoming cultured, more educated, more knowledgeable. Gutenberg's printing press. Let's see. The Reformation, despite the Catholic response to the Reformation demands, it shattered the unity of Western Christianity, and it led to, yeah, I was right, about 100 a century and a half of religious wars, internal conflicts generally reduced people's religious commitments, brought religious toleration. On the other hand, that's a positive thing. And also, out of the bloody religious wars rose skepticism and secularism. People decided we can't trust anything that the church is saying anymore, right? Let us let us base our lives not on the church anymore, but maybe on something like science. So rise of secularism followed what happened with the Reformation. Scientific revolution, great many discoveries promoted increasing sense in people that the key to truth lay in science, not in faith or tradition anymore. And I don't say it here, I don't think. This new attitude, a fundamental change in West, unlike other societies. Okay, so I don't say it here. So let me just add to this. It increased the sense in people that the key to truth lay in science. This often happened not voluntarily. The rise of modern science didn't happen because people wanted to accept these truths. The thing about science in the West was people had to be almost forced to change their thoughts because science has that force of forcing truth on you, right? If you believed the earth was flat, right? Columbus goes around the earth. You have to accept somehow, I don't understand, but the earth is actually round. Copernicus, when he first came up with his solar system, solar was that geocentric, heliocentric, right? Heliocentric theory of the solar system, the church branded it as blasphemy. People were killed for these things, right? Some of these scientists, or some of the scientists were religious people themselves. They actually got killed for their beliefs, but it had this force of truth. And once the force of truth kept pushing itself onto the society, people, I guess, begrudgingly, I guess is the word, right? Begrudgingly, sometimes even angrily, had to accept that these new things, these new truths that were coming out of science were true. So you give them long enough time, then science gains this force of authority, right? Everything is the same. The church, our traditions, our culture, everything is the same except science. Science is this new thing, bringing about new things, new truths, new way of looking at things. And someone like Newton, I have his picture there. The thing that Newton accomplished was they said, He united the heavens and the earth. That was his significance. They said, right? Newton, God said, let there be Newton. And the heavens and the earth were united because his theory of gravity forced people to say the heavens and the earth are the same, right? Before that, for all of maybe most of history, people thought the heavens is that's where the angels and God live, right? We human beings belong on earth, the heavens, for the angels. But Newton, I'm sure I mean, it wasn't just Newton's, it was all the scientists, Galileo Galilei, right, noticing the mountains on the moon. But so this attitude is a fundamental change that happened in the West that did not happen in other societies. So this is the thing I think that this is what we call the spirit of the West, right? This is the thing that propels West in the long 19th century to dominate the rest of the world. You cannot underestimate the impact that the scientific revolution had on the West. So some of the implications of the developments, let me just check the time. Lots of time, lots of time. Some of the implications. So cultural changes make West stand out from the rest of the world. So this was the unique thing that was happening in the West. I should say, by the way, because we talked about Russia last Tuesday, right? This is the kind of thing that Peter the Great witnessed. I said he spent time in the West, right? He learned shipbuilding, right? This is the kind of the spirit of the West is what he saw. And he wanted Russia to westernize because of these things that he was seeing happening in the West. Penetrated deeply into society, changing the attitudes of even ordinary people, creating a sense of individual and freedom and the sense that they were being guided by reason, science, and along with science, this age of exploration. The age of exploration, that's the beginning of the early modern period. I think this is a picture of Columbus saying, accept Jesus, to the natives. Uh, but, I say that because he's got a cross right behind him, right? I think this is Columbus. This could be somebody else. There are these names. I don't know all these names. So Christopher Columbus is the most famous one, but there were these other explorers. There's a guy named Captain Cook. Apparently, he was killed by the natives and they cooked him alive, or I don't know the story. But there were these other explorers, brave souls. Every one of them, they were brave souls because when they were setting out, they had no idea if they would reach land or they would starve or drown uh, on the high seas. So they were all brave men, but they were many of them guided by religious ideologies or just pure commercial ambitions. These changes had important implications. What were the implications? They almost guaranteed that additional changes would occur in the West. So these changes would propel West, like I said, into the long 19th century, where West would take over the world. They would color European view of other societies, how quickly we change, right? They began to view the other societies as uncivilized compared to them because they were modernizing, right? It's interesting how we human beings, we have very short memories. Let's say like 50 years ago, we were just like those guys. And 50 years have passed. Now we're saying those guys are savages. But then that means your grandfather was a savage, right? So it's this sort of short-sightedness that developed in the West because we are so advanced, right? They began to judge other societies through the lens of technological advances. Or well, it could be commerce, but technological advances, these savages, because they don't have guns or they don't have cannons. So that was an attitude that developed rather quickly in the West. Um, these developments in the West challenged other societies. So this is the other side of the picture. The way they responded to the West deeply affected their situation in the modern world. I mean, you could just easily imagine some societies would try to imitate the West. That's the case of Russia, right? Some other societies, like the gunpowder empires we'll be seeing later, they tried to imitate the West, but they couldn't do it as quickly. Other societies like China and like Japan, they chose to isolate themselves, and that I think was a big mistake at this time. Uh, so that is the rise of the West. We have lots of time before I move on to the gunpowder empires. I know I said a lot of things about the West, and it didn't take us that long, right? 45 minutes. So it's okay. Does anyone have any questions about the rise of the West? The rise of the West. Just, study enough for the test, right? Because we're being introduced to the rise of the West, right? We're going to talk about the West more after the midterm. The long 19th century, that is the time of the West taking over the world. And the modern times, it's again all about the West. Um, so we'll come back to the West. So, moving on to the gunpowder empires. So, this is the introduction slide. The emergence of Islamic gunpowder empires. So, these three Islamic gunpowder empires are officially what's called the gunpowder empires. So, the one empire is the Ottoman Empire. I think they were the longest. I think the earliest is the Ottoman Empire. They matured in the 15th century with the fall of Constantinople, but I probably say this later on. They matured. They achieved their full maturity by taking down Constantinople. That is the end of the post-classical age. But they basically took over from the Arabs. When we were talking about the post-classical age, we said post-classical age is interesting for the rise of the Arab civilization. They took the center stage, right? And then the Arab, that was like the first half, I guess. I'm being very simplistic. They took about the first half of the post-classical, and then they were supplanted by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans took over from the Arabs. Islamic, all Muslims, but the Ottoman Empire was Turkic people, I think we say Turkic. And then when it disappeared, when it fell, it didn't really fall as in it turned into what is now known as Turkey or Turkey, right? So it was a Turkic empire. And then of course everyone was conquered by the Mongols. That was part of the story of how everyone was conquered by the Mongols. And then after the Mongols declined and fell away, the Ottoman Empire emerged as the sort of the central Mediterranean power. It lasted, it's the longest lasting empire of the three. The Ottoman Empire only it only disappeared officially after World War One, I believe. So it lasted until 1920 or 22 or something. That's when it it changed into a Turkey. And many parts of the Ottoman Empire declared independence, like I guess Egypt and some of these other nations. A Mughal Empire came from Central Asia, invaded India in the early 16th century. So that's much later after the Ottoman Empire. The Mughal Empire is, so this is the Indian Empire. But the Mughals, like the Ottomans, they weren't Indians. They were, I guess, not the Mongols, but sort of like the Mongols. They were the steppes people from the north. Steppes, as in, these people good with horses and they shoot, these arrows. They can shoot, they can pretend to be running away, riding their horse, and then all of a sudden, without hands, they turn around and shoot you, and that kind of thing. Good horse riders. So the Mongols, but they were an Islamic empire. They took over India, and the Mughal Empire again lasted a pretty long time. It only fell as the British took over India. So these empires lead all the way to the modern times. The Safavid Empire in Persia revived the national identity at the start of the 16th century, but they're the shortest surviving empire from what I can remember right now. They kind of fell apart. So The Ottoman longest, and then World War One they lost basically, and then turned into Turkey. Mughal because of the British. So these three Islamic gunpowder empires are known as the gunpowder empires. Just the three, because historians they want to like associate gunpowder empires with just these three Islamic gunpowder empires. There were other gunpowder empires as well. We talked about Russia. Russia, I think I talked about Russia. Russia was a gunpowder empire as well, but we don't say they were gunpowder empires, but they certainly had gunpowder technology. And speaking of gunpowder empires, the Western European empires were the original gunpowder empires, but their power was mostly naval cannons. In China, the Qing dynasty, or the Manchurians, they became established by the middle of the 17th century. Again, they lasted very, very long until when did the Qing dynasty end? It ended around the time of the Russian Revolution. I think maybe around 1920 or 20 something, early 20s. So they lasted well into the 20th century. But of course, they became the subject of what's called the century of humiliation. So they had to endure a century of humiliation. That was the Qing dynasty, but they were a gunpowder empire as well. They had technological superiority, and that's how they could conquer, I suppose, what was it, the Ming dynasty? They conquered the existing Chinese dynasty because of the technological superiority. So it has some elements of gunpowder empire attached to it as well. Manchurians were from northeastern China, a separate ethnic group, and their story is similar to the Mughal Empire invaders shaping a country's history. So that's the introduction. Here, if you just look at the map here, I don't want to spend too much time with this. So here is the Russian Empire. You look at Western Europe. I mean, in terms of size, it's still not a very big area of the planet, right? This is Western Europe. This is where you see the protagonist, right, gaining strength, right? Becoming the superhuman, uh, I don't want to say hero, but the character that it is becoming. But this is the West, and westmost is like the British Isles, and here's the Russian Empire, the largest empire in the world. The Ottoman Empire, huge, right? Conquering all of the Mediterranean. This is 1700, so by then they were out of I keep referring to this as the Iberian Peninsula, right? But by then this was reconquered, the Reconquista by the Spanish, I think. I'm sorry, I that's not the right picture. I think that's I don't have that right. This map is wrong. This is no, this is I had it wrong. Sorry. This is Sicily. I'm sorry. That's Sicily. This is the Iberian Peninsula, right? The Strait of Gibraltar, I guess Gibraltar, that's the strait. Sorry. And the southern part of that was uh, ruled by the Ottoman Empire until they were driven out. Safavid Empire, this is where modern day Iran is, right? Safavid Empire revived. Yeah, I forgot to. No, I'll talk about it soon enough. And the Mughal Empire conquered most of India, and the Qing dynasty, huge empires that lasted for centuries. So these were the three gunpowder empires plus China and Russia. So the Ottoman Empire ruled Middle East from 1299. Right? So that's still well sort of latter half of the post-classical, but still that's about 200 over 200 2.5 years, what, 2.5 centuries before the fall of the Constantinople. They ruled Middle East and Southeastern Europe region. I'm just going to say this. You don't have to study this guy. I'm sorry, it's going to be part of the slide, right? But this picture, I'm just giving it to you. I'm not going to use this for any questions. So just cross him out. Osman, cross out Osman. They were Turkish people. They incorporated other ethnic groups because it was a huge empire, including many non-Muslims. It spread Islamic belief to the southeastern Europe, but Christians were tolerated. Like I said, they were, especially in that Iberian Peninsula, um, They were a very tolerant rulers as far as rulers went. Tended to discriminate against the Arabs, which was a peculiar thing. And it eventually, toward the end, would lead to the Arab revolt in the long 19th century and during World War One. And that was a strange thing that they would have something against the Arabs. Uh, I guess you relegate it to racism, maybe. But it is a strange thing because they were an Islamic empire, right? An Islamic empire, you should honor the Arabs because Muhammad was an Arab, right? The Quran is an Arabic, and you don't even want to say literature, but it's an Arabic text. And so there was a nationalistic, I mean, this wasn't a nation, this is an empire, right? But there was a nationalistic, or maybe you could say a racial element to the Ottoman Empire. They were a Turkish people, a different people. It introduced cultural changes in the Middle East, Byzantine architectural form of mosques, also significant contributions in literature and art. So once they took over, um, they inherited all that was the Byzantine Empire into their culture, into their tradition as well. The siege of Vienna in 1529, I don't know the details too much. So there were two sieges. They attacked Vienna two times. 1529 was apparently a glorious battle, right? The battle could have gone either way. They could have won, but they ended up not winning. So it was a glorious battle, and I guess the people of Vienna could be proud that they managed to repel these fierce warriors that were the Ottoman Empire. When it happened the second time around, 1683, apparently it wasn't much of a battle then. The second time around, the West by then was already much more advanced than the Ottoman Empire in their scientific or military war technologies of war, that it wasn't much of a fight. So it shows you how gradually the Ottoman Empire began to fall behind the West. So this is a good sort of example of that, right? The first time it happened, it was a close, two fighters equally matched kind of thing. But then by 1683, it was not an equal match anymore. It showed how backward Ottoman Empire had become. The Mughal Empire, numerous contributions to India, they transformed India. They were a transformative force. And in some ways, they gave the motivation for India to become the country it is today. Without the Mughal Empire, India may not be a nation today. So they brought in a lot of transformative things into India, right? So numerous contributions established a system of considerable tolerance because they were Muslims ruling over the Hindus. And Hinduism, uh, they didn't try to get rid of it, right? You have your way of worshiping God, or your multi, faceted, or your multiple deities, and we believe in Allah. And so they were very tolerant at the beginning. This is the way of empires. When it begins, they usually begin very uh, with a lot of tolerance. They tend to tolerate their subjects. And then apparently, oftentimes, they become gradually more intolerant. But they started out being a very tolerant rulers. 1526, victory marked the start of the Mughal Empire with Babur, its first emperor. Again, I have his picture there. I'm just going to say right now, you don't have to study him. So cross out the name of Babur. I'm sorry, Mr. Babur. But apparently he was a legendary figure. He became a ruler at 12. So I'm just going to skip the battle part. So the Mughal Empire added cultural richness into Indian tradition. A lot of what we consider Indian today came from the Mughals, including that gorgeous thing that we know as the Taj Mahal. That was a Mughal contribution. So, including Persian and Western artistic influences, important symbols, such Indian national symbols as Taj Mahal, was a Mughal contribution. Uh, right, the beautiful Taj Mahal. The story, what little I know, is apparently his beloved queen had died or something. So this was in memory of his beautiful queen. I could be wrong. I have no interest in things like architecture. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's just me. I'm not as cultured as I should be. They were interested in reforms because they were Muslims, right? Muslim is, in its own ways, very reasonable, very rational religion, right? They pride themselves as being rational, logical, and tolerant, simple, clean, clear in what is right and what is wrong. So they were interested in bringing reforms to India. Especially they um, they went against the practice of sati. I talked about sati, right? Sati is this particularly horrific form of religious practice tradition that developed in India, where a woman, when her husband dies, right, her husband is burned at a funeral pyre, right? And she's supposed to show her devotion by throwing herself into the pyre, burning herself alive to show how much she loved her husband. So this practice was rampant in India. They said, this isn't right. So they tried to stop the practice, but they didn't succeed because how can you police such practice, right? These things happening in rural villages, like you don't know whether they're doing it or not. So, but they tried to end the practice of sati. Inspired the idea of unity in Indian people, led to India becoming a nation after the British rule. Um, so it's because of the Mughal Empire. They ruled for, I guess what, over 15, 20, 18, so 300, over 300 years, right? So it was during their rule that Indians began to call themselves, yes, an empire, a people. We're all Indians. It wasn't like the Mughals are the foreigners, right? We are all Indian. And this is a fairly recent development. Sorry, so before I get to that, so uh, when the British took over, that idea of Indian people remained, right? Even though it became part of the British, one of the British colonies, the idea of the Indians as one people, that only grew stronger. Like I said, the idea of nation state flourishes as a reaction toward, I'm sorry, as a reaction against external forces, right? And this is a classic case of a nation being born as a reaction against its colonizers. Because of the way the British ruled India, the idea of national unity flourished, or it became stronger and stronger, and until you have a person like Mahatma Gandhi and who's that other Indra sorry Mahatma Gandhi, the only name I can remember. So it's an interesting thing that started to happen recently, that in India today, the Mughal Empire is vilified. There is a movement that's been happening for a while in India. So it's another kind of nationalism. I don't know too much about modern, like current Indian political situation right now. I just know the history of it, right? How at the moment of its birth, India became partitioned into India and Pakistan, and then later on Bangladesh. But part of that partition had to do with religion, right? The Hindus did not want to live with Muslims, and the Muslims did not want to live with Hindus. That was against Gandhi's idea. Gandhi's idea of India was this kind of idea of the Mughal Empire, all Indians being one Indians. But um, India was also not just for the Hindus. There were a lot of, there still are, sorry, I should say, there still are a lot of Muslims in India, right? So recently, India's nationalism started being identified more and more with Hinduism. That's the thing that's been happening in India. So because Indian nationalism began to be associated more with Hinduism, there began this movement of vilifying the Mughals, that the Mughals were not Indian, that they're the foreign occupiers. There were the Mughals and then there were the British, and now we are the Indians, free, independent, democratic Hindus. And so it's maybe we don't want to judge, right, what's happening in India because India is for the Indians, right? But I think we can kind of say what is happening today is unfortunate because it's part of their history. So historians would call what's happening today a revisionist history, right? They're revisioning their history to make the Mughals make them out to being the bad guys. So that is something that so from the early modern times, all of a sudden it's like what's happening in India today. But that's part of its history right now, vilified by the Hindu nationalist politics, right? Um, there's another thing I wanted to say. Yeah, it's just a supplementary thing. They began to teach these things in their public schools. That's why it made the news. This is already like several years ago. They started to change their school curriculum, history textbooks, began to talk about the Mughals as like foreign occupiers or something. And then, of course, if you are a Muslim living in India, you wouldn't feel good about that, right? Because for a Muslim Indian, the Mughal Empire, this was the golden age. So, okay, all right. Let me shoot. I just realized, okay, Safavid Empire, a very short lifespan compared to the other empires established by this guy. Again, oh wait, one thing, he declared himself the Shah of Iran. The title Shah would continue until the revolution in 1976, right? So this is the Shah. Uh, the Shia Islam promoted as state religion of the Safavid Empire, and the religion still survives today. This is the beginning of modern, historians say this is the beginning of modern Iran with the Safavid Empire. This is the beginning of their national identity. Shia Islam and the Shah. There is talk of some Iranians right now toppling the government, the theocracy, and bringing back the Shah, right? Because the son of the last Shah is still alive, right? Is a political figure living somewhere in Europe, I think. So Shah is still alive in India. People are saying it's a pipe dream. It's not realistic, but that's the Safavid Empire. It built Persian national identity, seen as the start of modern Persian history. Established Farsi as the Farsi is the language, not it's the name of the language, official language of the state, as the region's dominant language. Soon the Safavid Empire began to fight against the Ottoman Empire over religious differences and territorial disputes. You don't have to know these names here. Caucasus, I think, in Iraq. You don't have to know those things. You just cross them out. The conflict between the two rivals would stretch over 100 years. They would keep fighting each other. Muslim brothers shedding Muslim blood. Oh no! I'm sorry. Uh, the, so the so these are the three empires, right? The Ottoman, the Mughal, and the Safavid. The decline of the empires. They all began to fall behind Western Europe. Technological flow throughout the centuries used to go from east to west. Now the flow began to be west to east. And they tried to catch up, but they could not catch up with the West. The pace of change, the pace of scientific advancements in the West, no other countries could keep up with. So they were imitating, but they fell behind. The Safavid Empire weakened early in the 18th century. Invasion of Afghan forces ended them officially, but the fractured form of the Safavid Empire continued until modern day Iran. The Mughal Empire weakened even earlier in the late 17th century. Emperors, they reversed their policy of religious tolerance, favoring Muslims, creating the atmosphere of religious mistrust, and that led to their downfall. Intolerance usually goes before a fall. What is it? We say pride goeth before a fall or something, but intolerance usually goeth before a fall because of the reactions, the negative reactions it creates. Also, attempts to conquer the southern regions drained its sources. I'm sorry, I don't have time for this. The southern tip of the Indian subcontinent was always independent. We call that the Sri Lanka, right? Sri Lanka and the Tamil region, the southern tip, they could never conquer that. And that partially led to their downfall. By the 18th century, Mughal hold over India began to fade. Local princes gained more power, became more feudalistic, things fractured. And then that became food for the British company to consume. They manipulated these fractured local principalities until they took over all of India. East India Company took over. So we'll come back to the East India Company later. Britain officially recognized India after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Just very quickly, Indian Rebellion of 1857 started because it's a famous story. This rumor started circulating that the British soldiers made their Indian soldiers bite off, like when you're loading a gun, you have to like bite off part of the bullet or the cartridge. And this rumor began to circulate that the British soldiers started to grease the cartridge with the oil of like pigs and cows. And that was blasphemy to the Indians, to the Hindus, right? Because cows are sacred and pigs were unclean. So the British were mocking them. And this was the cause of this huge rebellion that happened. And the British, of course, they massacred a great number of Indians. And then this caused Britain to until then they had a facade of business. It's the company that's doing business in India. But after the rebellion, the British officially took over, made India their colony. The Ottoman Empire, for them, the golden age from the late 15th to the mid 17th century started losing to Europe. Yeah, I talked about this already, right? The Siege of Vienna, hoping to press into Europe. But by then, the technological superiority was too great. So it became a bit of almost a joke. It wasn't much of a conflict. They started to lose territory. They lost to the Russians, and then they suffered corruption and economic decline. The empire remained healthy into the 19th century, but then uh, they began this propaganda against the Ottoman Empire by the European powers because they wanted to, get rid of the infidels, the pagan Muslims, right? So they began this propaganda that the Ottoman Empire was evil and it was weak. This has come to be known as the sick man of Europe. The Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. They were weak and they were evil pagans, right? Therefore, if you were part of the Ottoman Empire, rise up, fight against the empire. We will help you. Like Egypt, I think is one example. Fight against the empire. So this became sort of almost a fulfilling prophecy because in the end they really became the sick man of Europe, and they kind of faded away. In 1922, turned into the Republic of Turkey. That's when it ended. Okay, I think this is the last slide, right? Let me just quickly go through the Qing dynasty, and I'll talk about China again after the midterm. So it's okay we hurry through this. Economy remained healthy, greatly expanded territory. It also signs of this is when China had its greatest landmass during the Qing dynasty. It lasted, okay, until 1912. That's when it fell. Population growth, better agriculture, peace and stability. But by the 18th century, it would become overpopulated, creating food shortages, social unrest. The Qing dynasty had the misfortune of being down and weak when the West invaded. That's why it had to suffer the century of humiliation. But it also began to be backward looking. I'm just summarizing here. It began to be backward looking. It didn't look forward into the future. It began to revel in the glory that was the empire, right? The Forbidden City, all of its Great Wall, all of its accomplishments. And the military was weakened because they were under the bureaucracy. It was the politicians who were getting rich, who had all the power. The military were just the servants of the court politicians. And that led again to them not being able to compete against the West. The Opium Wars and the Chinese-Japanese War, these things will happen in the 19th century to come. They were politically weak, led to their downfall. Oh, some closing thoughts. Please give me just a couple more minutes. I think this is the last slide. The Asian empires, Asian because this includes the Mughal, Safavid, and the Ottoman, well, Ottoman is Mediterranean. They didn't follow the developments in the West for needed reforms. China was open to it for a while, but then the relative openness of the Ming Dynasty, I talked about this, the Ming Dynasty closed itself off just almost on a whim. And the Qing dynasty ended in the early 18th century. Trade remained active, but the Qing gradually became more reclusive. They ignored what was happening in the West, which was their great misfortune, to their great misfortune. The Ottoman Empire systematically avoided many of the influential changes occurring in the West. Like, for example, when the printing press was banned, I'm sorry, what was happening in the West, they banned it in the empire because they wanted to control the thoughts of their own citizens. Just like what was happening in Russia, the Ottoman Empire did not allow these grassroots changes to happen in their own empire, and it kept the citizenry back. And one of the reasons why they ultimately became the sick man of Europe. Asia, this is the last one, sorry, the last one. So Asia, these empires, they did make progress, but they were overshadowed by the greater, faster developments in the West. So this is the last question, right? The gunpowder empires, they were making technological advances. They were imitating the West. So the question is, why could they not keep up with the West? And the simplistic answer, because we're out of time, but the simplistic answer is because of what I call the spirit of the West, right? The West had that spirit. I talked about it, so I don't want to repeat myself. They did not have that, right? And that was the difference that all the difference. It made all the difference. All right, I'm sorry I kept you late. If you have questions, you can still ask questions. I will see you Tuesday for the review or Thursday at the exam. Have a wonderful week.